The participant trickle has slowed down, so I think it's a good time to get started in the effort to save as much time as possible for our Q&A. My name is Linda Rogers, and on behalf of the CGA Research Committee, we welcome and thank you for attending our first CGA-IGC Research Committee webinar of 2023, Improving Efficiency and Fidelity in Clinical Research, EHR Data Capture and Building Structured Redcap Databases. If you have questions during the talk, please put them in the chat on your Zoom screen, and we'll reserve time at the end of the 3 presentations for questions from our experts. There are no CEUs offered for this webinar, so no need to worry about a follow-up quiz or documentation. I'm planning to introduce the 3 wonderful speakers up front to save on some of our transition time, and so we have more time for the Q&A as well. First up, we have Dr. Timothy Yen, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Gastroenterology at Loma Linda University in Loma Linda, California. He completed fellowships in both gastroenterology and informatics quality and systems, and was the 2023 CGA grant recipient for his work using the electronic health record to improve patient-provider communication of familial colorectal cancer risk. Dr. Yen will take the wheel for the first part of the webinar to review practical approaches to obtaining data from the EHR. Next, we have Dr. Ajay Bansal, who is a gastroenterologist and professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and medical director of Gastrointestinal Cancer Prevention Clinic at the University of Kansas Cancer Center in Kansas City. He has published more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and is the lead PI of a national study involving 14 NCI-designated cancer centers to test a novel vaccine-based strategy for prevention of colon cancer in patients with Lynch syndrome. And lastly, we have Mary Penny Mays, and she is the clinical informatics coordinator at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City. She has over a 30-year background as a program analyst working in support of health systems information management systems, specializing in data interfaces between systems. She developed and supported the laboratory information management system at a large research institute in Kansas City, and currently supports users across the University of Kansas Medical Center with all aspects of Redcap project development and data collection. Mary and Dr. Bansal will present part 2 of today's webinar, focusing on building and utilizing Redcap databases. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and Tim, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Slides. For some reason that made my PowerPoint shut down. PowerPoint's
Would you like me to share the one that you emailed?
No, I have it. It just, for some reason, my PowerPoint said shut down. But I have enough. Okay. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to the CGA Research Committee for letting me talk to you guys about a little bit about the informatics side of things. I'm really going to review a practical approach to extracting or obtaining data from the electronic health record. I'm really focusing on Epic today for a couple of reasons. One, it's the one I have the most experience with, as well as 2, it's one of the most common electronic health records in the United States. I do not have any financial disclosures, including from Epic. So kind of an overview of what I'll talk about today. First, I'll talk about what types of data there are. Then I'll talk about how to get a bird's eye view of what the volume is of to answer your research question using a tool called SlicerDicer that you may have heard of in Epic. Then we talk about how to define your population and how to use that. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to engage stakeholders to accomplish those goals. So first, before I talk about all the nitty-gritty, I want to talk about what types of data are there. So in the IT or informatics world, there's really 2 main types of data. The first row that you see is unstructured data. Okay, that is where the input of that data is kind of the default that we all do for clinical care. So that's basically typing up your notes, free texts, etc. The advantage of that is that they're default. That's what we're used to. However, when it comes to extracting that data and using that data for research or clinical registries, etc., it requires quite a bit of work, either manual chart review to really go through every single chart and record down that information, or in this day and age of AI, natural language processing, developing these fairly expensive or kind of high effort models to algorithms to find that data. And as I said, that can cost anywhere to up to the cost of a luxury car sometimes. However, the second type of data is called structured data. Now that structured data usually is something that requires a drop-down list like a smart list or a form where you click a button. So it just usually requires that you plan for something ahead of time, where the user or the clinician clicks on something or selects something. However, when it comes to getting that data out, it's much quicker. We'll talk about SlicerDicer and reporting workbench today. There's also something called Epic Data Warehouse, which is kind of a bigger version of all those things. The advantage of that, this structured data, is that it's very cheap to get this data out. It doesn't take a lot of time. However, this requires some planning and is limited to some specific situations. When it comes to structured data, I just also want to mention there's two types of structured data. One is discrete data. That's where we talk about specific data points. That's where you talk about answering a yes/no question, whether someone has a specific ICD diagnosis, etc. And there's continuous data. So that's on a numerical scale. That's weight, height, age. Both those things are still structured data. So today I really focus on structured data. The unstructured data is a little bit out of this, the scope of this talk. But today I'll focus on what's available today and readily available to use. So what is SlicerDicer? This is a tool in Epic to estimate the volume of a certain population. They can look at how many patients there are for a given kind of criteria, or encounters or procedures. It's accessible to pretty much every Epic user. So you don't have to be an informaticist, a physician builder, an IT analyst. You most definitely have access to this. I'll show you how to get there in a little bit. The pro is that it's searchable within minutes, right? And it's relatively easy to use, and it's just all within Epic. You don't have to get permission or anything like that. The con is that it is limited to predefined, structured, discrete, or continuous data. Okay, so it cannot search that unstructured free text data. How do you access it? I don't have a picture for this because it looks different for everyone, but I'm sure everyone has seen the Epic menu button in the very top left of that Epic program. If you click it, usually under a category called Analytics Catalog, there's one called SlicerDicer. Sometimes it's in a different kind of drop down, but it's usually in there. Then once you open that up, it'll ask you to select the data model. What that means is, do you want to look at patients? Like in this case, do you want to look at number of bed requests, transfer center requests? Sometimes they have ER encounters, procedures, etc. Then once you select, in this case, patients, it gives you this view. Okay, and as I said, everybody can access this in Epic. You can do it today if you want to. And in this case, at this specific point in time, Loma Linda had 2.4 million patients in the system. And then in that kind of middle right column there, those are the different things that you can do to try and filter and find certain subsets of populations. So in this case, I want to say in the blue box on the very right, I want to look for a specific diagnosis code. And that can be an ICD code or a SNOMED code. And here I gave the example of probably one of the more common ones that we have in hereditary called genetic susceptibility disease. Unfortunately, it's not a very useful ICD code. However, we'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay? So once you select that, then that 2 million patients in the system now narrows down to now 2,000 patients with that diagnosis in your system at this given time. And you can set a time frame and different types of ways to graph it, etc. Then Another option you can do is within that population, you can say, I want to know how many people have X characteristic and how many do not. And you can, in this case, what they call slices, say slice by family history. And in this case, I chose colon cancer. And where this data comes from, as I said, is discrete data. So this actually comes from whenever someone is rooming or seeing a patient, they have that family history form. When they click that they have a family member with colon cancer, they click that basically stores as this data that you can pull. Now, in this case, you see the colon cancers in green. Out of the 2,000 or so patients with that ICD diagnosis of genetic susceptibility, there's about 161 patients with colon cancer. Then what you can do is when you right click on that specific slice, that very specific subset population, you can then actually look more in detail at who are those 161 patients. And this is what's called reporting workbench that I'll go into a little bit later. Reporting workbench then gives you line by line for every specific patient or encounter or whatever, and it'll give you a variety of characteristics. In this case, they had patient's name, date of birth, age, sex, primary care doctor, etc. But now comes like the big question that is kind of probably one of the bigger challenges in not just the hereditary familial colon cancer research or the population that we take care of, but kind of in all of medicine, is how do we define this population? Particularly in kind of GI cancer genetics, it's not, the billing diagnoses aren't the most, robust way to look at it. And what we do have right now in this current readily available, that's already pre-set up for us, is ICD code, SNOMED code. There is something called an Epic Diagnostic Code Grouper. I'll just say a little bit about this. What this is that someone manually went in and they said, I want to know all the ICD diagnoses that are associated with colon polyps. So they will go in and look at benign neoplasm of cecum, check that, then add in benign neoplasm of ascending colon, check that, descending colon, check that, and they just basically group it under this EDG name. You can also try to define a population based on procedures, whether someone had a colonoscopy or certain surgery. And then the pre-structured data, like I talked about before, age, location, payer, insurance, etc. But what if none of these are adequate? This is often the case. Using the ICD code doesn't get us the MLH1 Lynch patient, doesn't get us those patients, just not very accurate. One workaround that I am a proponent of and have used is creating your own something called a smart data element. It's your own way to track and define your population. So a smart data element is basically some data point that instructs the electronic health record to record or track whenever it's used. Okay, and I have an example here on the right. This is just one of the smart data elements I created, and you can embed this in anything that is selectable. So this can be a drop-down menu like a smart list. It can be a template text. I'm sure many of you have heard of at least smart text or smart phrases. You type in dot whatever, and it brings up a bunch of text. Whenever you use that, it is possible to basically track whenever someone uses that. And it's completely customizable to a variety of characteristics. So the first example I'll use for this to illustrate this is using smart data elements within a smart text. So I have been doing this project on familial colon cancer recommendations of the generous support of both CGA and FIGHT CRC. I essentially created a template in the smart text form, where every time someone uses this template for pathology follow-up, this automatically has a smart data element embedded in. Now you can't see it, no one else can see it, except the person who wants to pull it later to extract this data later. So we've created a smart data element, we've embedded it into whatever workflow we think is the most useful for our clinicians. How do we actually get this information out? And this is where I'll go back to that reporting workbench that I mentioned before. So for example, in creating a hereditary cancer registry, what I am going to do here is I'm actually going to use those same smart data elements and embed it inside a smart list, a dropdown. So what I did here, you'll see in the right circle there, I said I created a drop-down list. I want to make sure that I'm using discrete data. I'm tracking whenever someone's using or clicking any of these selections in the drop-down list. In the middle column, you see element, and that's where I tell them what smart data element is it. Then in the right column, you'll see a value of A, B, C, D, and you can just basically just name it whatever you want, just so it's distinctive, and it maps to a variety of choices. In this case, I put in MLH1, MSH2, MSH6 Lynch, etc. So every time someone clicks one of these, it will, for example, if they click MLH1 Lynch, it will record this value of A in the database, and I can pull that later. To the person who's using it, all that looks like is just this drop-down list, which I'm sure many people have seen before. It's just a drop-down list, and as soon as that person clicks MLH1 and puts into their note, it will record it, and they don't have to do anything at all. Then I can basically go to reporting workbench. This is inside that Epic kind of menu again. That's a little different for everybody, and I can say, well, for everybody that's saw me in encounter, so I'm that encounter provider, I want to know who has used and filed any of these smart data elements. And in here, I said, I want the ones that it said A, B, C, D, E. Those happen to be the 5 Lynch syndrome variants that I put in that smart list. You can also then tell them what, once you define that population, what characteristics do you want to know about each of those patients? And some are already pre-populated in, some you may have to talk to stakeholders to kind of figure out how much effort it would take to create some of those things. And here's an example of what outputs. So there I said, out of all the Lynch syndrome patients that had used that smart list and recorded into their notes or whatever, I can then pull the patient name, age, sex, ethnicity like before. Now there's other stuff that might be useful. For example, here they have a column that tells us when was the last cancer diagnosis, when was the last colonoscopy, is the patient on aspirin, and none of those things were actually already built in to Epic, and there's actually quite a few that you may not realize exist. Then kind of to bring this all back around again, if you click the explore button, it actually brings you back to that SlicerDicer view again. So SlicerDicer and this reporting workbench is very well interconnected so that you're able to get this bird's eye view of how many people are in this specific population, as well as that patient level kind of detailed data. Now, I don't expect anyone's gonna, after today is gonna be able to just go and do all this themselves. That's a lot of stuff to learn. However, I think a useful approach is to identify who your stakeholders are and in what order you kind of approach them in. In my opinion, I think your first step should be to go to your clinical research leadership. They are your content advocate from the administrative side, as well as then going to your chief medical information officer, so that's called chief technology officer. Usually this is a physician that is essentially an informaticist, and they're in charge of all the IT things for the institution. For example, when COVID hit, they escalated to very high priority to be able to track all the COVID vaccines and COVID tests. And so they're the person that will help get your ask for building these smart lists and stuff to a higher priority. Then going to the physician informaticists, they're called physician builders in the Epic kind of system. They're your resource to explore what is going to be very easy to build or extract and what's going to be very hard and it's going to take a lot more time. Then I think the last stop should then be your IT services, so your Epic analysts. This is where you put a ticket in, all stuff. I think this should be your last stop because their expertise is in building and programming. However, they're not clinicians. And so I think you do need both that administrative support and as well as that clinical support and kind of bird's eye view to know what to ask of these analysts. If you're interested in learning how to do some of this yourself, if you just go to training.epic.com, again, I'm not sponsored by them, don't have any financial stake in them. They have a whole course catalog, they call it Epic University. A lot of these are actually remote now, so you can do it from home. And they vary from just a one day, few hour course just on the SlicerDicer, and that guides you through what I talked about today. Then there's what I did, which is the Decision Builder track. That was about a week of day-long courses and certification and exams, and that helps get you to a place where you can kind of make all this yourself. And then there's a lot more kind of courses for a variety of things. This is what it looks like. And as I said, the course catalog is a selection in there. Thank you.
So Linda, do you want me to start?
Yes, please go ahead, Jay.
Thanks. Looks like Tim must be a good chef.
The hard act to follow.
Yes. So thank you. I would like to thank CGA. Let me just make sure it's no. Linda, can you see my slides?
Yep, they look perfect.
Perfect. So I would like to thank and Tim, thank you so much for setting this up. And I was saying earlier, you must be a great chef in the kitchen, SlicerDicer. So I hope you can apply these in your kitchen too. So I would like to thank CGA Research Committee and especially Linda for the invitation and Evelyn for all of the coordination which went behind the scenes to get us all together today. I also noticed that many of you are on the line, and Dr. Patrick Lynch is also on the line. So it's an honor to have him on the call, and he's obviously extremely famous. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll give you a flavor of how to build a Redcap database. On the outset, it may seem a simple enough concept and easy to use, but it's good to focus on a few things before you embark on this journey. Because now you know that with Tim's help, you can identify all the patients at your hospital or at your institution who fit a particular cohort for your question. And then now you can build a nice database so you can do analysis. So what are the benefits of Redcap? So Redcap was designed at Vanderbilt in Nashville, specifically for research data collection. It has multiple functionalities in there. It allows extensive user access controls and permissions. For example, if you create the database and you have team members joining and leaving, you can, by a switch of a button and using their email, you can give them access or remove access. So you have good control over who has access. There are many methods to easily de-identify data. You can generate many reports to view selected data in the collection. You can generate queries. Let's say going back to Lynch syndrome, if you wanted to know how many patients with Lynch syndrome had colon cancer before the age of 30, you can easily do that. It also helps you to longitudinally collect data, allows you to do multiple study arms, definitely usable across multi-sites, so which can help with collaboration. And it can also be used for consenting your participants. Additionally, it supports administrative oversight of design changes to ensure that there is high quality data integrity. Also, multiple data export formats are available based on who you're working with in terms of analysis. You can export the data in CSV format or other formats as needed. Also, you can run basic statistics and charting of the data collection to just know ballpark numbers of what is happening with your data and what kind of information your data holds. We'll talk briefly about entering data in a few minutes, but there are many ways of entering data. As Tim pointed out, unstructured and structured data. So there's manual data entry following chart review. You can also use surveys. You can import data using an Excel CSV file, and this is very relevant. For example, if you already have an existing database at your institution, and now you're part of this multi-institutional collaboration, then you can use this function to import data as long as the fields match in the two databases pretty easily at the click of a button. Also, later on, Mary will educate us about FIRE methods to automate data entry from EHR, very exciting, which can decrease the burden of data entry. So like any other project, always begin by carefully considering the research question, have a clear hypothesis. Sometimes when we start building a database, we just want to get all the information without really thinking about the question we are asking, and that can lead to a lot of messy problems down the road. So focusing on the leaves while ignoring the forest is not a good idea. Be ambitious, but not greedy. So obviously, when we start thinking of a research question, we want to collect as much data as we can, but there has to be a limit, so that you can at least begin the project at some point. Also, carefully review the published literature carefully. This is very simplistic, but one of the approaches I use is that if I have a research question, I use some key keywords on PubMed or another website, find all the data, and then arrange them in chronological order, oldest to newest, to learn how the field has evolved and how does your research question fit into that evolving field. An important point is that you have to communicate these changes to your Redcap specialist. So as you are building a database, you will have many back and forth communications, and you have to communicate that clearly to your Redcap specialist. I'm going to touch upon the technique we use, which worked pretty well for us while we're building a Lynch database, a multi-institutional, or a gastrectomy database. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides and try to share my other slides. So just bear with me for a second. Can everyone see this?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. So I hope you can read the font. But what I'm trying to show here is that Excel is extremely functional to do something like this. So each of the worksheets is a form in Redcap. So what you need to think about is how do you want your Redcap to be structured? All these forms in Redcap can talk to each other through a common ID, and they exactly mimic what's in the worksheet. So this way you can communicate with your specialist who's helping you build the database about what changes do you want. For example, just to show you an example right here, we had all these variables in our database for a project looking at metabolic syndrome and cancer risk and previous history of dietary sensitivities and allergies in terms of link to cancer. And for example, here after doing a little bit of data entry, we realized that we have to remove some of the fields. So we created a column called action, which clearly tells the person who's building the database which field to remove, which to modify. And if she or he were to modify the field, then we told them exactly what task. For example, here initially we had something called alcohol use as the only variable, but we wanted to modify it to history of alcohol use disorder, yes and no. So that could be simply done through an Excel sheet, nicely color coded, easy to follow. So that's just an example of how you could communicate. I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but this is one of the many ways. Coming back to my presentation. I cannot overemphasize the importance of involving a biostatistician early on in the project. So I have seen many of these projects derail because you build the database, but you never involved the statistician early on in the project, do all the data entry, and by the time you are ready for analysis, it's very messy and you can't really do a good job of analyzing data. This slide just highlights how much collaboration you might need and how much time you might need with your statistician, depending on the type of study design. Controlled trials will need the highest level of collaboration. Prospective cohort, cross-sectional, and early other forms of studies may need lesser collaboration with your biostatistician. Now, once you have a basic structure of the Redcap database in the design mode, that's what we call it, the design mode. And finally, when it's ready to be used, it's called production mode. So clearly, you have to take it for a test drive, enter test data. Typically, what we have done is we have entered data on 5 patients randomly picked, and this can help you understand how the database is functioning, because there'll be enough variety across those 5 patients, and you can figure out if the fields are working and the choices are working. Again, I can't overemphasize about entering test data. You may also have multiple team members with a variety of expertise enter test data so that you have a good understanding of how, depending on the expertise of the individual entering data, the fields may appear differently to everybody. And so this way you can tweak the fields so that apply to universally to all data entry people. And don't be lazy. As the PI, always enter your test data yourself, because you can rely on your medical students or research personnel, but till you drive the Tesla yourself, you won't really know how well it drives. And again, I'm not promoting Tesla here. I'm just promoting electric vehicles in general. You need to think about who is going to enter data. So there'll be people coming onto the team to enter data. So you have to train new people how to enter data. So you should have a clear document to maintain uniformity about data entry. In collaboration with your Redcap specialist, try to make the fields foolproof so that different users don't use different terminology. Avoid free texting as much as possible, but sometimes depending on the field of research, free texting may not be avoidable. So let's briefly review a cheat sheet which one of our medical students created. Again, I'm juggling a few different documents, so hopefully this works. Can everyone see this?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. So again, an example of how we created a data entry cheat sheet or a document. So we are trying to build a large multi-institutional linked database. So we'll have many different people working on this over time. So for each particular form in the Redcap database, we have clear guidelines on how to enter data. What happens is I want to make sure that the data are all good quality. So I have instructed all of the data entry people to keep it unverified in the Redcap database until I go through the data. It doesn't move to verified status. So things like those can make sure that you have the highest quality data. So 10 years from now, when you have a question which comes up, you can still do a good job answering that question with as much clarity as you can. So that just gives you an example of how a detailed information sheet for data entry can be very useful as team members come and go. Going back to my original presentation. So again, in the last few slides, I want to emphasize that it can also be used to create Redcap database can also be used to create biobanks. There are many commercially available software to create biobanks, but they're very expensive. Clearly, in the field of research we are all in, biobanks will be key to answer many questions in the future. So it can work because it is free, technically speaking, highly customizable. You can have multi-site access login using institutional user credentials. So every institution can see their own data. This is very, very important while you're getting the protocol approved through the IRB, because it maintains data privacy. Electronic consent is possible, streamlined data entry, and you can also include patient surveys. And there are multiple dashboards which you can create for operational visualizations, which give you a snapshot of how all data look and how much data is missing, what's needs to be done, and so on and so forth. This is an example of how this can also be used to study genetic studies or genomic patient data. So PROMISE Consortium is the prostate cancer precision medicine multi-institutional collaborative effort to study prostate cancer. Using Redcap, they created a repository of de-identified clinical and genomic patient data to look at patient outcomes. They had a complicated structure of the consortium to make it highly functional, but they also had a lot of fields relevant to genomic information. This was formed by a collaboration of 16 academic institutions. The first patient record was created entered into the database in April 2020, and as of 2021, over 1,000 patients' data was entered without any problems. So this shows how, with the right collaboration, you can use Redcap database to really answer very, very important questions in your field. So finally, take-home messages. So clearly, you got to focus on the research question, be ambitious but not greedy. I call this 11th commandment, very, very important. You're going to have the right amount of greed to succeed. Oh, that even rhymes. Involve a Redcap specialist early on. You probably could watch enough YouTube videos and do this on your own, but I feel that by doing this for a while, almost for the past 15 years, involving a Redcap specialist like Mary Mays, who's going to follow up in a few minutes, is going to save you heartache, headache, stomachache later on. Test drive the database yourself. Don't be lazy. Don't rely on others. Time well spent early on, once you are in the design mode, is still it's going to pay off dividends in the future. And lastly, last but not the least, involve a biostatistician early on. It's key to a successful clean analysis in the future. Thank you so much. And over to Mary.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bansal. Whenever you're ready, Mary.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak with you today. I am going to talk briefly about some design choices that you have when you're building your Redcap project to help you build the best database you can. And then also I'm going to talk about how to collect your data and focus on using the FIRE method. So first of all, some project design do's and don'ts, really only one don't, which will come soon. First of all, although it seems pretty trivial, I want you to you should use short descriptive field names, because that's how you're going to communicate with your data analysts and your statisticians about your data. And related to that comes the one don't. If you have ever worked in Redcap and discovered this option here of enabling auto naming a variable based on the field name, I would say don't use it. That often results in some very bad field names. So try to avoid that. Make sure that your field names make sense to you and also to your statistician. Next, to keep your data consistent, you want to use multiple choice fields wherever possible. And you saw several examples of that in Dr. Bansal's slides. Again, free text sometimes is unavoidable, but you want to limit that as much as possible. The next step, Dr. Bansal again, he talked a bit about using multiple instruments. In a project, you can divide your data collection into sets of instruments. And you want to do that to keep your data collection organized. Also, Redcap provides something called calculated fields that allow you to automatically calculate the value of some fields based on what's been entered in other fields, such as the BMI. So this really helps you in two ways. One is you are controlling that calculation and not relying on your data collectors to understand how the data should be collected. And also it saves you probably some money when you're getting the statistician to work with your data, because your data will already have some calculations done. So the next do is to really in your instruments, whether you're designing or another person is designing for you, include instructions and pipe data on your instruments to help people who are collecting data understand how to enter the data. So here's one example. There is in Redcap something called a descriptive text field, and you can use these to provide a wealth of information to people as they're entering the data. And you can see here the instructions are given to the user, to the data collector as they're entering data of how they should enter the data. On this next example, we've used something called data piping. So those dates have actually been entered on another instrument, and then we can display it elsewhere into the project so that people can stay oriented to what types of data and events to which that data is linked. And then you can also include images and links in your descriptive text fields to help guide your data collection. And this is useful, again, because you may have med students who are not quite sure how to rank certain things or how to calculate certain things, and you can add links and images right there in your Redcap to assist them. So the next hint is to use repeating instruments to collect multiple sets of the same or similar data. So Redcap provides the ability to not only create multiple instruments, but also define instruments as repeating instruments. So this allows you to collect similar set of data multiple times. What this can do for you is really simplify your overall project design by not needing to create multiple variables to collect each instance of data. So you can see here, this is an example. The family history was set as a repeatable instrument, and we used other fields to label each of those instruments. So as we are collecting the data and looking at the data that's been collected for this particular patient, we can see that this data has been entered 4 times, and we can see the relationship and also the type of cancer that that family member had. Next, you can use what's called longitudinal design when that's appropriate. So in longitudinal design, you are collecting data over a period of time for the same patient. So multiple times over that time period. You can see in this example, we have all of these events and we've defined the time periods. And that's the first thing that you do when you use the longitudinal design. You actually just define your events. But once you've defined your events, then you can go back to your instruments and decide what type of data you want to collect in each of those events. So you can see here that, for example, demographics has been collected only once and will only be collected once. This similar situation is for procedure details and pre-procedure health history, but then vitals are going to be collected multiple times, as is laboratory data and medications and all of these other instruments. And this is what it would look like for a single record when you started collecting the data. So you can see when you're looking at the record that data has been collected for this first event, and then some data has been collected in each of these events. So the final question that we're going to answer here is how you will collect your data. And Dr. Bonsall mentioned these briefly. First, you can do manual data entry into your Redcap using chart review, and that's a great and very frequent way to enter data into your database. Each of your data collectors would need to have a login to Redcap, and they would log in and directly enter the data into Redcap. Another method is using data import. You do have to create a file that is formatted to match the fields in your Redcap project, but it is perfectly possible to collect your data into a separate database, into a separate spreadsheet without logging into Redcap, and then later log into Redcap and import it. Another method that's very common if you need to collect your data from your study participants directly is to use survey. And finally, this is the latest method that's available. It's to use what's called FHIR to automate the data entry from the electronic health record. Redcap has developed tools that can use the FHIR resources for collecting data from hospital systems. So how is FHIR used? FHIR resources are basically just categories of data seen in healthcare. And you are all familiar with all those categories. These are just a few: demographics, laboratory results, and medications. Both Redcap and your electronic health record must be configured to communicate, to use the FHIR resources. But once everything is configured and the connection is made, Redcap can receive that data using FHIR. The first tool that Redcap provides for you to start using FHIR is what's called the mapping helper. This mapping helper allows you to enter a patient medical record number. So if you've used SlicerDicer, for example, or you've identified your patient cohort, you can enter a patient medical record, select a resource or a subcategory within that resource, then tell it to fetch that data. And the mapping helper will then display all of the data that could be retrieved for that particular patient. So that's a great way for you to explore what kind of data is available via the FHIR connection from your health medical record to Redcap. The process is called using a clinical data pull in Redcap. And when you enable that on a project, it allows you to set up a mapping from the electronic health record, such as Epic and Cerner. I know that Redcap has worked with both of those electronic health records. I'm not sure what other ones that they have actually worked to develop. So to use the clinical data pull, the first thing you have to do is have a place to put your data in your Redcap project. And these are all Redcap fields that I have created in a project. Once that's done, then you can use their mapping tool, to actually find the corresponding data in the EHR. And so you can see here, I have done a search and I have found this field. And then I want to map it to the Redcap field. And in addition, if you're set up using events, you can map it to a specific event, and you have a reference date so that you have something to help you find the correct value in your electronic health record to map into the correct field in your Redcap. After you have set up all your mapping, then you move on to adjudication. This allows you to review the data that's going to be pulled into your database. So this is on a record in Redcap, and when I'm ready to adjudicate, I can simply say refresh the data from Epic, and it will display the data down here that it is fetched, that's been mapped from the electronic health record into your Redcap project. You can see here it has not automatically updated, and you review and make sure that it is actually pulling the correct value into the correct field. And then you can accept that and your database will be updated. Auto adjudication is possible, but you never want to turn that on until you're really satisfied that Redcap is mapping the correct data to the correct Redcap fields. And that also has to be enabled overall in your Redcap instance. If it's not, then it will not be available. And in conclusion, Redcap is continuing to add to the list of FHIR resources that can be selected for mapping. So you can see here, this is the list of types of FHIR resources that are currently available to be mapped from your health record into Redcap. They will be adding more as time goes on. They are also working on better ways to allow developers to customize their own mapping so that they can go in and find data using the mapping helper and then create their own pulls using FHIR. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can go back to our sponsor for questions.
Thank you very much, Mary. Just a reminder to everyone, so we have about 8 minutes for questions. If there's any others, please put them in the chat, but I've been collecting them throughout. Tim, I have a couple, I think, softball questions for you just on the logistics of SlicerDicer that I'll just share back to back is just confirming when you identify the patients through SlicerDicer and say you come up with 67 patients at the end of the day, do you just have the 67 as a quantity, or you then have access to the patient identifiers?
I think that question probably came in right before I went to that slide. When you right click on that specific slice on that graph, then you say show slice and reporting workbench, then it will literally tell you line by line all those, each specific patient.
And somewhat related from logistics is that when you're identifying patients by ICD code, is that only identifying patients that have that ICD-10 code as part of their problem list, or any time that's been used? So for example, under billing.
Good question. A lot of them, they usually have the option to choose either or both. So I think like billing is one, and encounter diagnosis is one, and then problem list is another thing. Yeah, and then problem list, I think it gets a little complicated in terms of like terminology for billing, but yeah, there's you can basically have any combination of those.
And Dr. Bensal, I'm going to let you opine a little bit on this, but do you have any thoughts on how we can communicate with Epic on kind of formalizing some of these fields that they can be used across institutions, and or not, of course, not every institution uses Epic, so how some of these other EHRs can communicate with each other?
Absolutely, Linda, and that's obviously $1 million question, and we could probably talk for a while, and I think Tim may know a little bit more about this, but I think he pointed out earlier that we really have to involve all the stakeholders across many institutions to bring that kind of change. I think what you're asking is how fields across many different electronic health records can be universalized for used for research, correct? Yeah, so that's obviously a $1 million question. Tim, any comments on that?
Yeah, this was a very well-known, I guess, headache of, and the reality of informatics is, in the end, all these electronic health records are companies, right? They're businesses. And so there is a conflict of interest when it comes to collaboration. Now, for example, in the US, CMS and the government saw that, right? They're like, we had to have some interoperability. And so they had that promoting interoperability kind of part where they tied it to like a quality metric reimbursement. It's a pretty low bar to start out with. So there is some kind of, I think, oversight and push to have some of these things interoperable. It just depends on a little bit on how high priority is it to kind of the larger, community or the government. For example, there was like the Smart and Fire thing during COVID. There was a whole company that came out trying to standardize how COVID vaccination like cards were like digitized essentially. And it did great during COVID. Then COVID kind of got better. We had the people were being hospitalized as much, and then that company, it's called Common Health, kind of, I think they're still around. They kind of just teetered out, because there wasn't as much kind of financial and then like political pressure to drive that. So I think a lot of it does have to come from the top down in terms of prioritization of what is something that should be interoperable.
Thank you. And
I will jump in and just mention also that if you are working with collaborating with somebody at another institution, you can certainly work with them and a Redcap specialist and other informaticists to help you unify the data that you have in each of your fields to a single field. We are actually working on a project like that right now, so that we are building a single Redcap project that collects data from multiple institutes that may be on different health records.
Going to you, Mary. So, our first two speakers are coming from the clinician side of things, but I imagine you probably get a lot of projects coming across your desk that have been designed by clinicians and not necessarily folks in informatics. What would you say is a common, or maybe the number one issue that kind of clinician design projects come to you with that you wish people knew in advance?
I would say one of the things I see a lot is people not understanding how to use multiple instruments within a project and how to really collect the consent in one form, move on to another instrument to collect the next set of instrument, and how to automate a lot of the surveys. So those are all things that many people probably could benefit from just coming to someone first and saying, I have a project, I want to collect this data, how should I do it? That's would be my best advice, really, just to not hesitate to go to a specialist and say, I'd like a little advice.
We all have to find our Marys in our own institution. And then I think this is the last one, maybe that was in the chat for Tim, is figuring out ways using the slicer data to potentially use it based on registry data rather than kind of demographic page in Epic to get more precise information.
Like using, my guess is that like they have a separate registry and they're saying how can they get that data over. I think, well, one is the option, like I mentioned, like creating your own smart data element, right? Essentially, what you're doing is trying to define your population, right? Who is under this specific race or ethnicity. And so just like you're building a registry, when you type it in to Redcap or whatever, you could also just implement into the workflow to have them, it can be a random note to put in that smart data element to say, this files to the smart data element for this specific race or ethnicity. And that way you can basically create, customize your own essentially so that it is a little bit more accurate. Now on the bigger picture level, if you're trying to look at thousands, tens of thousands of patients, that's obviously a lot of work to do. I know that there is a big push from Epic to expand how kind of finite and better, better tuned their health equity and social determinants of health are. Like in my local Epic, I just recently saw a bunch of stuff come up with like discrete data regarding like social vulnerability index, like tobacco, what zip code they live in, and stuff like that. And I think that ethnicity is also one of those things that is starting. I remember there was an institution in the Bay Area that actually tracked not just like Asian, they actually saw Asian - South Indian, Asian - Nepal, and so you basically have to build that in either at the institution level or at kind of a bigger level.
Maybe we should have a number called 1-800-CALL-TIM.
I'm going to put you on speed dial, I know. But it is 1 o'clock, so I know we have lots of other things that all of us are doing. But thank you so much to Tim, Ajay, and Mary for all of your time and expertise. I'm sure there's lots of other questions, but hopefully we can find the versions of the three of you in our own institutions. And I just want to remind everyone on the call that our next webinar that is for CEUs is August 24th about living with FAP. So stay tuned for emails coming from CGA to tune into that webinar. But again, thank you so much for your time and have a great afternoon.